I was just asked by the chairman to introduce myself. The good news for you in terms of timing and the good news for me is I don't need to introduce myself, because if you look in your bags, you'll see a big pull out about what Burges Salmon does in terms of the marine energy market. We're a firm of lawyers. So I will move rapidly on then to my marine-based slide. And this is a mixture of lessons learned and also hot topics about what's going on out there, drawn from both the wave, the tidal, wider sectors as well, and lagoons and tidal range. And the first thing is contracts for difference, which is becoming an increasingly hot topic. And when I heard it this morning, Robert mentioned it from G-Wave this morning in terms of governmental support. The marine industry actually was very, very happy when it got £305 and it was recognised there as a strike price and it had its 100 megawatts deployment. What probably the marine industry didn't concentrate on, because when that came out we were all very happy with the renewables obligation and 5 rocks, was really how the CFD works and the mechanics of it and the principles behind the CFD, which, let's face it, ultimately lead to competition, and competition between projects and developers, and caps and levy control framework amounts. And so I heard this morning from someone who I think was mentioning tidal barrage or various others. Let's not forget, and I'm not picking a technology here, but let's not forget there is a cap on the amount of money which this government is prepared to spend on supporting renewables, or more to the point, clean energy, by which they also mean nuclear. So a big pot of money out of the levy control framework that goes to one project or one technology takes it away from all those other projects. Something that I think we all need to bear in mind. The CFD is very complicated in terms of auctioning and allocation. Now, hopefully the marine sector will not get to a stage where it's in competitive auctions, but it may well do if the budget is used up. And I think the industry is just coming to terms with the fact that the mechanics really don't work for demonstration sites, for the small-scale demonstrators that the Crown Estate has announced. And so there's going to be a lot of work and a lot of focus on that over the next few years. And I would encourage you, if you are looking at deployment, if you are looking at projects going forward in the next few years, to familiarise yourself with the process on contracts for difference, because I don't think this sector has done enough on that, partly because it's got had other priorities up to that point. So that's me on CFDs. I can come back to this in questions. Design contracting structure. This is a lessons learned. And the lessons learned here, and actually Paul mentioned it right at the beginning, is really think wider than your immediate project. Think and your technology. Think about how the package and the structure, if you're a project developer, needs to be put together. And don't, the temptation is always to do things quickly. You've got all sorts of other things that you need to factor into your mind. But the reality is you need to give some proper consideration to these contracting and design structures early on to understand how they're going to fit together and what investors are going to want to see and what funders are going to want to see later on. And if you skimp at the front end, it just leads to a world of pain at the back end, believe you me. So really sit down, think about it, work it through. We've got a couple of examples out there now in terms of projects that have gone through this process. Take the lessons learned from those. Next one is grid infrastructure. So a lot of what's happening in the UK at the moment is around pinch points in grid connection. Now we know in Scotland they've got pinch points in grid. We know now in other areas of the country, including Wales, I believe, that there's pinch points in certain areas on grid infrastructure and grid connection capacity. And what that's meaning is that we need to come up with different ways of connecting in, different ways of getting projects away with grid. And some of that is leading to shared grid connections and taking capacity and possibly even buying and trading capacity. That's good in one sense, but it also leads to issues and problems which do need to be overcome. The onshore industry, over the last few years, particularly solar and onshore, when we've done a lot of shared grid agreements, they are not easy things, and there are issues there when it comes to later funding individual projects that are relying on the basis of a shared grid connection. So what I would say there is, if that's something that's going to be a possibility and something that you're looking at, be very, very careful and do understand what you're going to need from that process and from that agreement going forward. EHS, environmental health and safety. The point I would make here very, very quickly is it's not going away. In actual fact, if you look across the piece, and I'm not saying necessarily the marine industry is any worse than any other sector, but across the piece, Environment and health and safety is being taken more and more seriously. The fines are going up. The penalties are going up and have gone up in the last year or so dramatically on anyone who's breaching environment and health and safety law. So it is something to be aware of. The marine industry, as often said, needs to be incredibly careful, obviously, from a health and safety perspective, from a reputational perspective in an early stage. If we have bad incidents, it's going to reflect on us and it will halt and stunt development and progress for everyone else. Joint ventures and joint development. There's a lot of talk, partly because of the funding for marine, but in renewables you see it now extensively. Joint development agreements, joint ventures. So the point I'm making there really is they're becoming increasingly attractive, more common. The reality is you do, again, need to think those things through, because it all sounds fine, as any joint venture does when you go on in. Those of you who know about joint ventures will know that it's not about when you go in, it's about what happens if it goes wrong, I'm afraid. Sorry, I'm a pessimistic lawyer, but you do need to understand in joint development terms what the roles of each party are going to be, how they're going to fund it, what happens if it does fall apart, what happens if it's not falling apart but one person just says, look, do you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. It's no offence to you, my other joint venture partner, but this is not my core business anymore, I need to exit. What happens? What happens in those circumstances? Decommissioning is an issue out there. I know it's close to heart around here, but the reality of decommissioning is that this sector is going to pick up some fairly hefty burdens on decommissioning bonds going forward, partly because of issues that have happened elsewhere, but the reality is that that incurs a cost for a project and is not to be overlooked. Habitats is just becoming increasingly more challenging. The EU legislation that's coming out on habitats and the interpretation of it is just getting more and more draconian. And it's leaving less and less wriggle room for developers and less wriggle room for the authorities who are dishing out consents. And if I'm really honest, and apologies for those regulators that are in the audience today, what we regularly see is paranoia amongst the regulators who are looking at awarding these consents, that they're going to be challenged. And they are challenged often, and they're challenged by those interested parties, and they're using habitats again and again and again as a method to delay or quash consents. And I'm afraid the message on this one is it's only going to get worse, because far from the interpretation of EU law becoming more realistic, it's almost going the other way. So it's going to be incumbent upon this industry going forward to think about how we're going to persuade people that habitats isn't an issue, persuade the regulators to push forward with decisions, to work out how we're going to challenge and combat challenges, and possibly even, dare I say it, be a bit more robust with the regulator in actually trying to push through some consents. And then last but not least, state aid. State aid, because of the industry, because of the funding that was up there before, because of the amount of grant funding that's out there, and because of the mishmash of funding, we were involved with the funding of Magen, which brought together a whole wide variety of different funds and different sources of funding. State aid is an issue that everyone needs to be aware of, and the limitations around it and what you can and can't do. And it's really important to know that as a basis right from the outset, so that you know when you're accepting grants and funding what that's going to mean in terms of limitations and conditions later on down the line. And I'll leave it there, and you can raise anything in questions.